All right, so we're back and diving right into a story that I know a lot of you have been following closely.
The Coutts Four.
Exactly, the Coutts Four. And, well, everything surrounding the legal battles that kind of came out of those 2022 Freedom Convoy protests. It's been a wild ride.
Oh, for sure. And it's been fascinating to watch. Even though the Coutts blockade was smaller in scale than what we saw in Ottawa, it's become this kind of microcosm of the entire Freedom Convoy movement, wouldn't we say?
Absolutely. You see all those same themes popping up, right? People pushing back against what they see as government overreach, that whole debate about freedom versus safety. And, of course, did the government go too far? Was the response proportionate,
Yeah, all those questions are still swirling around.
big time? So for anyone who maybe hasn't been following this as closely, let's set the scene, right? February 2022. The Freedom Convoy protests are happening across the country. All these folks are fired up about the COVID-19 mandates. And then in Coutts, Alberta, this group of protesters decides to shut down a major border crossing.
Right, and that's where our Coutts Four come in. Tony Olenek, Chris Carbert, Marco van Huigenbos, and George Jansen.
And, I mean, this wasn't just some symbolic gesture, right?
No, not at all. They brought that border crossing to a screeching halt for weeks, caused major disruptions to trade and travel, and now the legal fallout from all of that is playing out. And let me tell you, the charges are serious.
We're not talking about parking tickets here.
Not even close. We're talking mischief, conspiracy, and even conspiracy to commit murder.
Wow. Conspiracy to commit murder. That's a heavy one.
It is. And that charge stems from the firearms and ammunition that law enforcement found during the blockade.
But it's important to remember that these guys and their supporters say those charges are bogus, right?
Yeah, a lot of people who support the Coutts Four are adamant that the protest was peaceful, and they say any talk about violence was taken out of context.
Yeah, and one of the things that has really captured public attention is how everything went down during the investigation and the arrest. Lots of questions about whether it was all handled fairly.
Oh, totally. That night entry warrant that they used during the arrests has been a huge point of contention.
For those of us who aren't lawyers, night entry warrant, what does that even mean?
Basically, it allows the police to do a no-knock raid, bust in without warning. And some people see that as way too aggressive, especially considering, as we've said, the protests were largely peaceful.
Right, so you have the defense lawyers saying, hold on, there are inconsistencies here. The warrants don't add up, and there might even be some police misconduct going on.
Exactly. And to add fuel to the fire, there are claims that the police might have even twisted some facts in those information to obtain documents, the ITOs.
Ah, the ITOs, the legal paperwork they use to justify getting those warrants.
Exactly. But we can't get into the specifics of those claims right now because it's all under a publication ban to make sure the Coutts Four get a fair trial.
Okay, so we've got these serious charges, some potentially shady legal maneuvering, and then on top of all of that, public opinion is completely split down the middle.
It's pretty wild. The Coutts blockade really tapped into some deeply held beliefs about the pandemic, government mandates, individual freedom, you name it.
Yeah, it's like all those tensions that were already simmering just boiled over in this one little town.
Exactly. And at first, there was a lot of local support for the protests. People saw these guys as standing up for their rights, pushing back against government overreach.
Which is something we saw across the country with the whole Freedom Convoy movement, right? People were fed up with the restrictions and felt like their freedoms were being eroded.
Absolutely. But then, as the blockade dragged on and those allegations about firearms and potential violence started to come out, the mood started to shift.
Yeah, now you have this huge chunk of the population who say the Coutts Four are to blame for all the chaos, and that the government had every right to step in, even if it was heavy-handed. But you still got lots of folks who are on the side of the Coutts Four and see the whole thing totally differently.
Oh, absolutely. And their perspective is crucial to understanding this whole mess. They see these guys as scapegoats for the entire Freedom Convoy movement, and they believe the charges are way too harsh for what they actually did. And they're not convinced that the legal process has been fair and impartial.
So we're basically looking at this situation where nobody can agree on the facts, everybody's got strong opinions, and it's hard to see how you can even define what justice would look like in this case.
That's a pretty good summary. And the outcome of this whole thing could have a huge impact on how future protests are handled in Canada.
Yeah, this case raises some big questions about where the line is between peaceful protest and, crossing the line. How do we balance individual rights with public safety? And what role should the government play when people start speaking out against them?
It's a whole can of worms.
For sure.
It really makes you think about, what are our rights in this country and how much power does the government really have? I mean, expert speaker. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And to really wrap our heads around all of this, I
Yep.
think we need to dig a little deeper. Look beyond those attention-grabbing headlines and actually see what's been happening in the courtrooms during the trials of the Coutts Four.
Yeah, let's do that. So those trials, for 3 of the 4, Marco van Huigenbos, Jerry Morin, and Christopher Carr, those have been pretty revealing, I'd say.
And remind us what those guys were charged with.
Right, so their charges range from mischief, which is basically intentionally messing with someone's property or stopping them from using it legally, to something way more serious, conspiracy to commit murder.
And we've talked about that charge already, but I think it's worth repeating just how serious that is. I mean, for some people, it just doesn't seem to fit with the image of the Coutts protest as mostly peaceful.
And you're right to point that out. It's crucial to keep in mind that the Crown's entire case rests on the fact that they found firearms and ammo at the protest site. Plus, they're using those intercepted communications as evidence suggesting there was a plan to hurt law enforcement officers.
But if I'm remembering correctly, the defense is saying, hold up, those guns were totally legal, and that the conversations were taken out of context.
Exactly. They're arguing that there was never a real plan to harm anyone. They say the prosecution is going overboard with this conspiracy to commit murder charge, and that the Coutts Four were simply exercising their right to protest. That just having firearms doesn't mean you're automatically part of some murder plot.
So it's like we have two totally different stories here. Two sides, each presenting their own version of events, and it all comes down to how you interpret the evidence and what you believe the Coutts Four were really trying to do.
You got it. And that's where the judge has a really tough job. They have to look at all the evidence, listen to the witnesses, and decide if the prosecution has actually proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The stakes are sky high here, not just for the Coutts Four, but for how this whole thing could affect protests in Canada in the future.
It makes you wonder if a guilty verdict could actually discourage people from protesting in the future. I mean, what if people become afraid to participate even if they're completely peaceful because they're worried about facing serious legal trouble?
It's a valid concern, for sure. A conviction here could really blur the lines between what's considered a peaceful protest and what's considered a crime. We could end up in a situation where people are too scared to exercise their right to gather and speak their minds, even when they're being peaceful.
What about the flip side? What if they're found not guilty? Could that be seen as a sign that the government overreacted to the Freedom Convoy and that the courts are willing to stand up for the rights of protesters, even if those protests cause some disruptions?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. An acquittal could be seen as a criticism of how the government handled the protests, and a win for those who believe that protesting, even when it gets messy, is a fundamental part of a free and democratic society.
It's pretty amazing how this one case has become a lightning rod for all these bigger debates about individual freedom, the power of the government, and what's acceptable when it comes to protesting.
It really shows you just how complicated it is to try and balance all these different values and interests in a democracy. And we can't forget that the conspiracy to commit murder charge is only one part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
The Coutts Four are facing other charges too. Things like mischief, obstruction of justice, possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose.
Right, so even if they're cleared of the most serious charge, they could still end up facing some pretty significant penalties.
Absolutely. The penalties for those other charges can range from fines to jail time. It all depends on the specifics of each charge and what the judge decides. We definitely need to keep following the case closely and pay attention to the arguments being made by both sides.
It's a powerful reminder that we need a strong and fair legal system, one that protects everyone's rights while keeping society safe and secure. As this case moves forward, it's super important to have thoughtful and respectful conversations about it. We need to understand that there are complex issues at play here and that people on all sides have strong beliefs. We'll definitely keep you in the loop about any major updates. But for now, I think this deep dive has given us a much better grasp on the Coutts Four case, all the twists and turns, and what it could mean for the future of protests in Canada. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, talked about the background of the Coutts Four case, all the controversy around the legal stuff and those clashing views on the whole Freedom Convoy thing. But let's get down to brass tacks. What are these guys actually facing in court, and what could happen to them?
Well, as we've mentioned, each of the Coutts Four, Tony Olenek, Chris Carr, Marco van Huigenbos, and George Jansen, they're all dealing with their own set of charges, and the potential consequences are pretty serious.
Yeah, let's zero in on that conspiracy to commit murder charge, because that's the one that seems to be causing the most concern and debate. I mean, we're talking about a really heavy charge with life-altering consequences.
Absolutely. You can't downplay the seriousness of that charge at all. A conviction could mean spending the rest of your life behind bars, and the Crown's argument is built on those firearms and ammunition they found at the protest site, along with those intercepted communications that they're saying point to a plot to hurt law enforcement officers.
But the defense is sticking to their guns, right? They're saying, no way those firearms were legal. And those conversations were taken totally out of context.
Yeah.
They're saying there was never any intention of actually carrying out any violence.
Right. They're arguing that the prosecution is going way too far with this charge and that the Coutts Four were just exercising their right to protest. They're saying that just because someone has firearms doesn't automatically mean they're part of some conspiracy to commit murder.
So basically what we're looking at is a situation where it's really up for interpretation,
Mhm.
right? The evidence is open to different interpretations. The intentions of the Coutts Four are being debated, and it's going to come down to who you believe.
You're exactly right. And that's why the judge's role in all of this is so crucial. They have to sift through all the evidence, evaluate the credibility of the witnesses, and decide ultimately whether the prosecution has actually proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And there's a lot riding on this decision, not just for the Coutts Four themselves, but for how this whole thing could set a precedent for protests in Canada going forward.
Yeah, that's a huge point. If they end up being convicted on this charge, could have a chilling effect on protests down the road. Could people be hesitant to participate, even if they're committed to being peaceful because they're worried about getting caught up in something like this and facing serious legal trouble?
That's definitely a legitimate concern. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where a conviction in this case makes it a lot harder to distinguish between peaceful protest and criminal activity. And that could lead to people being afraid to exercise their right to assemble and speak their minds, even when they're doing it peacefully.
But what about the flip side of that coin? What if they're acquitted? Could that be seen as a sign that the government went overboard in their response to the Freedom Convoy, and that the legal system is actually willing to stand up for the rights of protesters, even those who might engage in destructive tactics?
That's definitely a possibility, too. An acquittal could be interpreted as a sort of slap on the wrist for the government for how they handled the protests, and a win for those who believe that the right to protest, even if it gets a little messy, is a fundamental part of a free and democratic society.
It's pretty amazing how this one case has become a focal point for all these bigger debates about individual rights, the power of the government, and the limits of protest.
It really highlights just how complicated it is to try to balance all these different interests in a democracy, right? And we can't forget about all those other charges the Coutts Four are facing on top of the conspiracy to commit murder charge, things like mischief, obstruction of justice, and possession of a weapon for a dangerous purpose.
So even if they manage to dodge that most serious charge, there's still a chance they could end up facing some pretty hefty penalties.
Exactly. Those other charges carry a range of potential consequences from fines to jail time, depending on the specifics of each charge and what the judge decides. We definitely need to stay tuned and see how this whole thing unfolds. Pay close attention to the arguments from both sides.
It really drives home the importance of having a legal system that's strong and fair one that protects everyone's rights while also ensuring that society as a whole is safe and secure. As this case continues to play out, it's so important for us to have these conversations about it in a way that's thoughtful and respectful, acknowledging the complexities and the strong beliefs that people hold on all sides of the issue. And we'll definitely keep you updated on any major developments as they happen. Anyway, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the Coutts Four case, all the ins and outs, the different perspectives, and the potential implications for protests in Canada going forward. It's a story that's far from over, and we'll continue to explore it as it develops.